Hello and welcome to EDHREC's Upping the Average, where we take a commander's average decklist as compiled by the data on EDHREC and make some quick swaps to it to help take it from a good start to a great one. This week we're tackling one of the most requested commanders ever in the history of the Upping the Average series, and I bet a whole bunch of folks saw the video of this Chronomancer and said, it's about time. Obeka Brute Chronologist might be one of the best commander designs I've ever seen. Grixis 4 mana 3/4 is some nice stats, and the text line is so elegant and simple. Tap to let the current player end their turn if they would like to. There are so many cool reasons to preemptively end our own turn, and we see a bunch of them pile onto Obeka's EDHREC page. Tons of cards provide a huge upfront payoff, but have delayed downsides. By interrupting the regular flow of time, Obeka dodges a ton of negative side effects, only ever experiencing the best of times and never the worst of them. Let's check out Obeka's average decklist by copying it from the average decklist feature on EDHREC and importing that list to the Archidect deckbuilding website. As always, any swaps we make to this list must either keep the total price cost neutral or else help lower the overall cost of the deck. Full confession time. Obeka is a commander I've wanted to make a video about for a really long time, but I didn't know if I was fully ready to tackle her right away. Gazing at her deck data has always felt very difficult to parse. It literally feels like walking into a clockmaker's shop or something. There's stuff ticking everywhere, and there are so many things to pay attention to that I found it very difficult to get my bearings. In fact, if I can pull the curtain back even further, every time I tried to write this video and shared the script with fellow friends or fellow editors, they also found it confusing. To those who become familiar with Obeka and her rhythms, it does eventually settle into a very logical rhythm. But it's tricky to introduce yourself into that headspace, so I hope that I'm able to convey things properly for folks who know Obeka well and for folks who are trying to figure out her deal. Before we get to her core cards, let's do a quick rundown on how her effect works. Obeka is a legendary Sundial of the Infinite, or sort of that 2-mana version of Discontinuity. She taps to end our own turn whenever we want to. She can also tap on someone else's turn to ask them if they would like their turn to end. There are political applications to this, and some players really lean into that direction for Obeka, but that political angle is not a major theme in the average deck as we see it here. Ending our own turn prematurely can yield a ton of benefit. Some of Obeka's most classic cards, for example, involve card advantage. Ideas Unbound draws 3 cards, but would make us discard them later. Psychic Vortex cumulatively draws more and more cards, but forces us to discard our hand. Avaricious Dragon is similar. By escaping the end of turn downsides, we get to draw tons of extra cards for super cheap. However, let us take very careful note of how Obeka really works here. We must absolutely always keep in mind when we want to use Obeka's ability. We aren't just ending our turn during our main phase to skip the end step altogether. We wait until the end step occurs, and then the negative triggers go onto the stack, and that is when we use Obeka to end the turn. For example, let's take a look at some of the most classic cards that Obeka players are using to show how this is important. Obeka decks currently make excellent use of sneak attack effects, including cards like Ilharg and Perforos. They cheat huge beasties into play, but also have triggers on the end step that will make those beasties go away. We don't want to sneak attack a creature into play and then end the turn before we hit the end step. If we skip the end step, we will avoid that negative triggered ability, it's true, but we'll only have delayed it, because that trigger will just pop back up on the next available end step. We don't want to just delay it, we want to permanently get rid of that negative effect altogether. So instead, we activate a sneak attack, cheat a big creature into play, and after we're done with it and move to the end step, at the beginning of that end step, the negative trigger goes onto the stack. Then we tap Obeka and end the turn. Anything that's on the stack, such as spells and abilities, will then be exiled. The negative trigger goes away for good and doesn't pop back up again. And it's about here that I would want to get started and just start talking about Obeka's core cards and upgrades, but we actually have one more bit of housekeeping to do because there's another slightly confusing thing to discuss here. On Obeka's card, note the very particular wording in her reminder text. Any this turn and until end of turn effects end. This is very specific wording, and it's one of the most commonly misunderstood parts of Obeka's toolkit. The biggest example of this misunderstanding is with effects like Act of Treason, which gains control of a creature until end of turn. At first, it almost seems like you could use Act of Treason to gain control of a creature, and then use Obeka to end the turn so that you don't have to give the creature back. But that isn't the case. No matter when she ends the turn, an effect that lasts until end of turn will still end. And that seems like an easy enough distinction, but there's one more wrinkle in time that we have to cover too, and that's the phrase at end of turn. Years ago, Wizards used the phrase at end of turn to denote end step triggers, but that phrase has since been updated to become the phrase at the beginning of the next end step. As an example, look at the card Rakdos Guildmage, which doesn't appear in this average deck list, but it has seen printings on either side of that errata wording update, so it serves as a good example. Note the different wording in its final two abilities. The phrase at end of turn is now at the beginning of the next end step. This will be true for any cards that say at end of turn, but not all of the cards that Obeka wants to play have seen newer printings that feature this updated wording, which can make this a little tricky. But the key word we're looking for is the word at. This change only applies to the phrase at end of turn, and it doesn't apply to the phrase until end of turn. So, for example, look again at that Act of Treason card, and then look at an older version of that effect, the card Threaten. One is old, one new, but both of them still say until end of turn. There's no change in verbiage there. If you're looking over cards for Obeka and wondering which ones have new Oracle text and which ones don't, keep that at and until distinction in mind. And most of all, trust in the precise wording of Obeka's reminder text. Until end of turn effects will end no matter what she does. But the at effects, which now say at the beginning of the end step, those effects are ones that she can play with. You can see why this is a video that I wasn't fully prepared to jump into too quickly. I mean, we're how many minutes in, and we haven't even gotten to Obeka's core cards, let alone to her upgrades. This is complicated stuff. We're literally picking apart specific word choices here. And as much as I would love to present myself as being naturally super wise about this, the honest truth is just that, no, chunks of this are really confusing. So I hope that this serves as a useful baseline to understand how this commander works and how to navigate the upgrades that we'll be making. Okay, let's talk about those core cards now. We've seen some excellent sneak attack effects in this deck, using Obeka to keep the creatures in play for good, but that's just the beginning. We can use a card like Zara to steal creatures from opponents' hands, using Obeka to make sure we never have to give them back. Or there's Hellkite Courser, which is especially funny because it can put Obeka right into play, give her haste, and then she can end the turn in response to the trigger that would send her back to the command zone. And after that, we have to address the temporary tokens. Hate Mirage makes temporary tokens, and when those tokens try to leave, Obeka can lock them into place forever. This is a huge part of Obeka's identity, from the Mirage to the Mimic Vat, and even to some of the infamous legendary creatures. Kiki-Jiki and Ryanya over there making all those copies? Yeah, cool, how about we make them stay forever? In fact, there's a huge swath of enchantments here that are just dedicated to making tokens of extra friends for us, and Obeka stops the clock to make sure they don't go away. Just a few extra copies of a few big creatures means we'll take over the board in no time. Pun not intended. And as if that wasn't enough, we also have some extremely clever removal effects unique to Obeka too. Identity Thief, Void Walk, these cards exile an enemy creature and will trigger at the end step to bring the creature back. But instead, Obeka can be like, nah. End the turn in response to that delayed trigger, and the creatures stay in exile forever. Holy wow, that's epic. Amphin Mutineer is particularly noteworthy because of its Encore effect, an ability we see on a couple creatures in this deck. The Encore tokens would sacrifice themselves at the end step, but instead Obeka can end the turn, so that even this removal effect on a creature will help maintain extra board presence on our side. And speaking of graveyard effects like Encore, the graveyard is yet another thing Obeka has found a way to manipulate. Cards like Felden of the Third Path, Cauldron Dance, or Cedrus can all cheat things right back to play, and our commander will make the battlefield their permanent destination. These are another exciting space for Obeka to explore, because they're basically sneak attack effects from the graveyard. In fact, they're so potent that there are actually a ton of cards in this deck directly devoted to filling the graveyard, to take advantage of this dynamic more easily so that we don't have to wait for our creatures to die before we start cheating them into play in exciting ways. But the absolute most important part of Obeka's entire deck are, of course, the final fortune effects. Take another turn after this one, and at the beginning of that turn's end step, lose the game. Or, according to Obeka, sweet, cheap extra turns. End the turn in response to the end step trigger, and you get an extra turn for just 2 mana. With all those huge creatures we've managed to stick around and play, these spells are the nail in the coffin for our opponents. So, with all this hopefully understood, let's actually, finally, tune up this deck. We'll do so in 3 primary ways. First, a section I'll call Clock Stopper. Second, Keeping Watch. And finally, Budget Time. We'll start off with part 1. There are some cards in this deck that people need to stop playing, and there are some cards not yet in this deck that people need to stop not playing. Let's just get into it. There are some cards I'm really excited to add. My first cut is blessedly simple because we already talked about this rules non-bow. Molten Primordial has that same Act of Treason wording, so its ability does not interact with Obeka to let us keep the creatures it steals. It's a fine card even without Obeka being able to use it, but in my opinion, this is not the Primordial that our deck deserves. Up next is a trickier card, one that technically does work, but also technically doesn't. Delina should not be in this deck. For the record, this is tricky, and there's good reason to think that this does work with Obeka, because Delina's tokens do have a triggered ability that Obeka could respond to. The problem is, Delina's tokens have that trigger at the end of every combat step, not just her own. So even if Obeka saves the tokens, they'll just die on the very next turn. Fun as she is, that means Delina's out. I'll get to some fun replacements for those in a bit, but first we have to address the lands situation in this deck. This number is too low. Even if we're cheating things into play, we need to be able to reliably cast our commander, and this land count isn't enough to help us do that. But it's okay, the lands we're gonna add are freaking hilarious with Obeka. First, I'm going to take just 3 simple lands that aren't as vital to this current list's optimized mana base, and swap them out for bounce lands. Sounds weird, but there's a really good reason for this. First, this deck has graveyard synergy, so a bounce land on turn 2 sometimes lets us get to 8 cards in hand, and we have to discard down to hand size, allowing us to place a big beater right into the yard right away. But here's the real kicker. Bounce lands have a triggered ability. When they enter the battlefield, their bounce effect goes onto the stack. In response, we can end the turn with Obeka, exiling that bounce trigger. Boom, free bounce land. That's too good to pass up. But you know what's even better than that? Lotus Field also has a trigger that Obeka can respond to. Enters the battlefield, trigger asks us to sacrifice lands. Nah, we'll just end the turn and keep a free 3-mana land, thank you very much. This interaction makes me giggle every time. And finally, this deck currently contains a Crumbling Necropolis, and since I want to bring up the land count by 1 more, I'm going to throw in a Path of Ancestry here too. It's also a tapped land for our 3 colors, but sometimes we could describe when we cast our commander or any other wizard. Alright, nice and simple stuff. Section 1 is short and sweet, so now it's time for part 2. If the first section covered the basics, this second section will cover the tactics. Now it's time to make some swaps not just for clever rules reasons, but for strategical impact. So the first thing I'm going to do in this section is gonna seem weird coming from me, because y'all know I like necromancy, but I didn't love all of the reanimator cards in this list. Gruesome Encore, Wake to Slaughter, and yes, even the Rakshasa just didn't delight me, even with the understanding of how Obeka will amplify their effects. Wake to Slaughter is probably the easiest to explain. Our opponents have more control here over what gets to come back. I'm not a fan of that. As for Gruesome Encore, this is the one that really frustrated me. 3 mana to temporarily get back a dead enemy creature, but we also need Obeka around to make it stay. That's a really tricky thing about this deck. If Obeka's around, the cards are cool, but without her, they might be downright bad. And in this case, 3 mana to get an enemy creature for 1 turn, in a format where Animate Dead consistently gets back creatures from any graveyard for just 2 mana? I know it doesn't grant haste, but still. And at first, I wondered if the higher popularity of Gruesome Encore was because of budget reasons. But it turns out, no, that's not the reason. Footsteps of the Goryo, for example, is currently twice as popular in Obeka decks as Animate Dead, and that is a more expensive card than Animate Dead. Anyway, I'm not adding in any of these, I just think the cleverness is getting in the way of actual efficacy here, and that is why I fell out of love with the Gruesome Encore. Speaking of Encore, my last Reanimator cut is the Rakshasa, which has the Encore ability. Whenever it attacks, it steals a dead enemy creature, which is cute, but middling. We're capable of some pretty fast starts in this deck, so we don't actually always have a creature to steal. It can also Encore to bring back token versions of itself attacking each opponent, and when the tokens would trigger to sacrifice themselves, Obeka can respond at the end of the turn, exiling that trigger so that we get to keep the tokens. So while this is really cool synergy, my problem is that it's also a lot of mana to pull this off. Fear not, I still love stealing from enemy graveyards. I just think that since we removed 1 Primordial earlier, we should swap out this Rakshasa for the Sepulchral Primordial instead, which gets a bunch of creatures back all at once. This is a great enter the battlefield effect for us to cheat into play with a sneak attack or a reanimation effect, even if we don't have Obeka in play. And not only that, but this deck has a ton of token copier effects too. I genuinely found Sepulchral to have better timing and better synergy with this deck's construction than the Rakshasa because of how many cool ways we can manipulate the enter the battlefield effect to steal valuable cards from our enemies for good. But hey, that's not the only reanimation effect I'm adding in. Are y'all familiar with Dawn of the Dead? This is a weird little doozy of an enchantment. It costs 1 life to keep around, which is negligible, and it brings back a dead creature every turn, exiling it at the beginning of our next end step. That's okay, Obeka's got us covered. And even if we can't keep our commander around to help, it's also just cool value to resurrect whatever we sneak attacked earlier for a quick repeat performance. In fact, if you sacrifice the creature before the exile trigger, Dawn of the Dead can even keep getting back that same creature every single turn. This is a very fun engine that constantly keeps our enemies on their toes. I also want to note all of the looting and graveyard filling effects in this deck. Fact or Fiction, Faithless Looting, this deck really likes to have ways of getting big creatures into the graveyard to resurrect for super cheap, so I want to flesh that out a bit more. Chart a Course is a terrific little spell, drawing 2 and pitching away some big creature, or just straight up drawing 2 if we've been aggressive. And Scattered Thoughts is a super underrated little common. It's not Fact or Fiction, but it's not Fact or Fiction. 4 cards, but we get to choose where they go? That's really solid. After this, I have 2 final cuts, both of which genuinely do make me sad, and they're really just a byproduct of how extraordinarily tuned up this average list already is. Fate Stitcher is the first, and Saheeli Rai the second. These both have awesome synergy with Obeka, but the problem is, so does everything else in the deck too. Fate Stitcher's Unearth ability is really cool to use Obeka to keep it in play even if it dies, and the tap ability can be tricky, but I didn't feel that we had too many applications to use it, even when I added in the cool bounce lands earlier. I've mostly found it useful as just a defensive tool, since we only have about 3, maybe 4 tap effects in the deck that we'd really want to try to use more than once a turn, and I didn't feel that that was necessary. As for Saheeli, I think this is probably easier to explain. She's mostly here for the -2 effect, which gives us a temporary copy of something that Obeka can help us keep around for good. Since this is immediately bringing her down to 1 loyalty though, it's not a reliably repeatable effect. And truth be told, we have so many other versions of this effect in the deck already that I think we're gonna be okay without her. Again, though, these cuts are just a byproduct of how enormously tuned up this list already is. Every cut is painstaking at this point, and if you love these effects, keep rocking on with them for sure. Alright, that leaves us with my final card to add. What could it be? Well, it's gonna look silly at first, but I can't help myself. It's Hive Mind. Maybe my eyes are bigger than my stomach here, but I really love casting this card and then casting a Final Fortune and forcing each opponent to cast that same spell and for them to lose the game on that next turn. Good luck, everyone. Welcome to Obeka's world. Those are my official swaps, but before we move into the budget section, let's briefly discuss some higher budget honorable mentions. To be honest, the main ones will come in the form of reanimator targets. These are incredibly personalizable, and depending upon the rate at which you sneak things into play, or revive them, or make copies, you can customize the creature loadout in a bunch of interesting and deadly ways. Everyone's gonna have their favorite creature targets, and it's a fun space to play around in when moving into more and more lavish upgrades. I'll also shout out Kroxa specifically here, because Obeka can respond to the sacrifice trigger to keep it around, which is really funny. Aside from the creatures, there's another extra turn effect, Warrior's Oath, that is very spendy, but certainly of interest to luxuriant Obeka decks. And after that, I think it's also probable that high-end Obeka players move into some fun combo territory too. For example, since the deck already contains a card like Kiki Jiki because of its synergy with Obeka, a Deceiver Exarch or Pestermite could join it to create the famous infinite combo. Or, since Final Fortune is an instant, you could grab an Isochron Scepter to imprint and cast it every turn, always using Obeka to avoid losing the game on each of those turns, and thus totally dominate the game. You might find similar results with some form of Underworld Breach combo too. By pairing this up with Brain Freeze, you can consistently recast an extra turn spell from the graveyard, and use Brain Freeze on yourself to keep the graveyard full, with Obeka ending the turn to keep you, and the Breach, around for good. Alright, that should do it. We've got our official list here, and you can find it in the description below. But now it's time to look at Obeka through a different lens. Let's make this deck more budget-friendly. There are some spectacular cards in the average Obeka list, but you don't need them to play Obeka spectacularly. The changes we'll make in this section will reduce the cost of the average deck by about $550. First, let's address the mana base. A big chunk of the deck's price is here in the lands, and we can save a bunch if we ignore the shocks, fetches, and even the battle bond lands. Which, WotC, I'm begging you to reprint these, please. In their place, we'll be okay with some temples, budget color fixers, and I like the Kaldheim duels for their land types too. These are just examples though. Play the mana base that feels most comfortable to you. After that, let's aim to lop off nearly everything over $10. The Tutors, Rhystic, the absurdly expensive Dockside can all go. And several other cards like Sneak Attack can go too. Last Chance is perfect for Obeka, but it's $50, you know? And finally, we'll ditch these famous blue spells too. Epically good, but we'll find fun replacements. This leaves us with a lot of holes to fill, so let's get to it. I want to start by adding in 3 pieces of kinda sorta removal. Feed the Swarm is nice for this deck to better deal with enchantments, Negate is a great counterspell that doesn't cost an arm and a leg, and I also want to shout out Tail's End. This is a funky one, but I think it's actually kind of great here. It can counter an enemy commander or catch someone out by stopping an ability, which is fun in and of itself, but it also has uses on our own stuff. If Obeka isn't able to stick and play, we can use this to still avoid a negative triggered ability from our own cards, which is both surprising and pretty sweet. Oh, and since we lost a board wipe in the big budget culling, I'll add in my favorite budget board wipe here, Deadly Tempest. I've KO'd players with this card before. It's a really nice way to reset the board when we're really behind and punish players while we're at it. Up next, here's a very nice card for Obeka. Anger. We have to get it into the yard, which can sometimes be tricky, but once it's there, it helps our commander out a ton so that we don't have to wait for Summoning Sickness for her to use her awesome ability. Alright, after this, I'm gonna get weird, but I hope you'll tag along with me, because these are pretty funny. It's a slight shift in the identity of the deck, but I think it's a fun shift too. First, I'm adding in Brutaclad, which might seem a little silly, but look how many token makers this deck contains. Brutaclad actually has a lot of targets to make additional copies of our additional copies, and that's especially true after our final 4 additions. I think it's fun to add in a bunch of Myriad cards to a budget Obeka deck. Creatures with Myriad make token copies of themselves when they attack, and those tokens go away at the end of combat. But that is a trigger that Obeka can respond to. By ending the turn with those triggers on the stack, we get to keep the copies, and those copies also have Myriad, so we'll multiply our board every time we attack. Note that this is still very tricky timing, because this involves us ending the turn at the end of combat, rather than a lot of the other triggers that occur at the next end step. So you have to be clever about how you pull this off. But if you can do so, it swamps the board super fast. And for our last addition, I'll give a quick honorable mention to Blade of Selves, which would have been the 4th card to add, but which is out of budget. And instead, I'll opt for the little-known Mirage Phalanx, which also makes a ton of tokens for combat and for us to manipulate to our heart's desire. Our opponents won't know what hit them. Alright, that'll do it. Here we have a much more budget Obeka list with a bit of a fun new twist. You can find both deck lists in the description below with the cuts in the maybe board. Alas, we cannot go any longer because Obeka is ending the turn. If you have any other recommendations you'd like to make for your fellow Obeka players, make sure you leave your suggestions down in the comments below, and as always, thanks so much for watching.